Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Seek and Find Life's Fundamental Concept series. This is going to be our second episode on the needs framework, and this episode is going to be focused on awareness in the needs framework. So, just to start off, I wanted to review what our goal is for the entire Seek and Find Life program. And that's number one, to bring needs into awareness, and number two, to empower people to fulfill their needs. And the reason for this is that we believe that this results in happy, loving, giving people, and that's what we want. This episode is going to be especially focused on number one, bringing needs into awareness, and the part of the needs framework that's relevant to that. So first we can go to our needs framework chart. And last episode, if you saw the first one on the needs framework, for like 1 second, I pulled up like this really complicated needs framework chart, and then I simplified it back down. We're going to be slowly building back up to that full chart in this little mini group of episodes on the needs framework. And so I'll be adding in little pieces of it here and there with each episode. And then by the end of it, we should be able to get back to that whole thing, which is actually a lot less scary than it looks at first. So the first one here is I just added a couple arrows to what I went over in the first needs framework video, which is awareness and control. And honestly, this is actually not too complicated. Basically, what this is saying is when you have a need, it's not something that you're aware of, right? So if we go back to the hunger example, when my body needs food, that's something that kind of happens, you can say silently, or you could say, hidden. I don't really know. I'm not aware of the fact that my body needs food, but my body has this great thing where it lets me know through a feeling. And the feeling I am aware of, right? And the feeling kind of leads to a thought, and then hopefully the thought leads to a behavior that's eventually going to help me fulfill my need. And so in this case, the fact that my body needs food is not something I'm directly aware of, but the feeling of hunger is something that I'm directly aware of. And that feeling, I can interpret that, I can understand the meaning of that feeling, that it's letting me know that there's an underlying need that I can't feel, that I'm not aware of, which is that my body needs food. And so all this little awareness arrow is saying is that we're aware of our feelings, we're aware of our thoughts, we're aware of our behavior, but we're not necessarily aware of our underlying needs, or at the very least, we're only aware of it in a very indirect way. The second part here is this little arrow for control. And what this is saying is we have active, direct, conscious control over our thoughts and our behaviors, right? If I want to think about school, I can think about school. If I want to think about work, I can think about work, right? Now, of course, sometimes things come into our mind for sure, right? But in general, we can kind of control our thoughts. And then our behaviors, we have control over. One thing or one example that I kind of use in the physical realm that's kind of similar to this is different parts of our body, right? And for example, our heartbeat, you can kind of consider is kind of like our feelings. I can't really think my heart to beat faster, right? Maybe I can think about something scary or something like that. Or what I could do is I could run outside and run up and down the block. I could sprint for a second and then my heartbeat's going to go up, right? But I can't really think my heartbeat to go up or down, right? It's not something I have really conscious control over or direct control over. I do kind of have indirect control over. There's things that I could do to either increase or decrease my heart rate, right? Even if I change my breathing. But it's not something I have kind of direct control over. Our thoughts, I would kind of more relate to our breathing. And it's this interesting thing where our breathing is when I want to consciously control it, no problem. I can breathe deep, I can breathe shallow, I can hold my breath, right? But when I'm not really thinking about it, it just kind of goes on this autopilot. It's really interesting. It's this very interesting human experience. So I would put thoughts kind of in this in-between category where on the one hand, if I want to purposely think about something, I'm going to solve a math problem or I'm going to, do something or think about something, I can consciously decide to think about it. But somehow my thoughts kind of go on autopilot in a way. I don't know if you've ever had the experience where you're driving your car and you just feel like you just kind of went on autopilot, or we use this term spaced out or something like that. Is your mind just kind of went on its own and did whatever it wanted to do. And so that's what I would call kind of when your breathing goes on quote unquote autopilot, is when your thoughts go on autopilot. Then you have your behavior. And for the most part, and going back to this whole autopilot thing, that can kind of include your behavior too. But I would say for the most part, we're really directly controlling our behavior. So I would relate this to something like moving my arms, right? I don't think my arms have ever gone on autopilot or moved by themselves, right? They pretty much only move when I tell them to move. I have to make a conscious decision. If I don't make any conscious decision, if I make no decision, then they just lay there. And that's kind of how it works. So you can think of it, or at least for me, it's been helpful to think of it kind of that way, where our feelings are kind of like our heartbeat. I really don't have any direct control over it, although there are things that I can do that have an impact. My thoughts are kind of like my breathing, where I do have direct control over it, but when I'm not directly controlling it, then it kind of goes on an autopilot. And then my behavior is more like, me controlling my physical body, like my legs or my arms, and that I'm pretty much having to control all the time. If they don't get any orders from me, then they just don't do anything. And so that's pretty much what this is saying here, is we're aware of our feelings, we're aware of our thoughts, we're aware of our behaviors, but we're probably not directly aware of our underlying needs. And I have direct conscious control over my thoughts and my behaviors, but not really over my feelings and not really over my needs, right? And we're going to talk more about this when we get to intervention and like how do I actually get to fulfilling my needs and how do I get to quote unquote controlling or managing my feelings. But at least for now, all I'm doing is explaining the chart is that's what this is saying, is I have awareness of feelings, thoughts, and behavior, but not of needs. And I have direct conscious control over thoughts and behavior, but not of feelings and needs. And then coming to the next slide here is a big question that we'd like to try to answer, which is where do feelings come from? Where do feelings come from? And the really simple answer, and this really kind of surprised me when I first heard this, is that feelings come from needs. It's very interesting. And to be slightly more specific, feelings come from needs being fulfilled or unfulfilled. And oftentimes when needs are fulfilled, we feel happy, we feel satisfied, we feel joyful, right? When needs are not fulfilled, it can present in quite a number of different ways. But as an example, anger, sadness, and anxiety are just 3 examples. And so that's where feelings really come from. They come from underlying needs. And this is a really big part of what we do here at Seek and Find Life. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time to go into that in this video, but there's more and more layers here that we can get into in other videos and over time. And so the next concept that I want to go over with regard to where feelings come from is the idea of something called stimulus or trigger. And this is probably one of the really key things to understand early on when you're learning about this framework, because it really has a lot to do with empathy, which is something that we're going to talk about in later videos, and how do we help people to get their needs fulfilled. And so I really wanted to go over specifically this concept of stimulus and needs, or you can say stimulus and causes of feelings, right? And so you can see on this chart here, we have needs, feelings, thoughts, and behavior. So you're probably pretty familiar with that now. But there's this thing at the top of the feelings that says stimulus, right? And I'm still trying to think of like a really good way to describe this. But anyways, the best that I can do right now is I was thinking back to earlier this year, I had a stomach issue. And I have this stomach ache, right? And it was kind of like this ache that would kind of go on basically all the time at the time, but it would get like better and worse at certain times. I was like more and less aware of it at certain times. Sometimes if I was, doing other things and got distracted, it would almost like go away. I'd stop thinking about it, but it would still come back. And so I went to the doctor. And when the doctor went to diagnose me, they would kind of push on different areas of my stomach, and they're trying to find out which organ, is it my small intestine? Is it my large intestine? They told me this later. I don't know much about medicine, but anyways, so they're pushing on different areas of my abdomen, right? My stomach area, to kind of figure out where the pain is. And when they push on certain areas, then I didn't really notice that much pain, or at least not in addition to what I was feeling all the time. But when they push on a certain area, then it's like, oh man, like that hurts, right? Or I'm like really aware of it. And the reason I bring up this little story is that the cause of my pain was that I had this underlying stomach issue. I had a disease, right? But the stimulus for the pain was when the doctor pushed on a certain area of my stomach, right? It would be kind of a silly thing for me to say is like, oh, the doctor pushing on my stomach caused the pain, and if I just never saw the doctor, then the pain would go away. Well, that's not quite true, right? Because number one, I'm always feeling it, and it gets better and worse at certain times for sure, right? But I'm pretty much always feeling it. But it got a lot worse when the doctor pushed on a certain area of my stomach. Or another way you can say it is I became much more aware of it when the doctor pushed on it, because it like that feeling became like super strong and super it was very clearly in a certain area. And so I like to draw this kind of analogy here with our emotional or psychological part of our being here, which is when certain things happen. You could call them stimuli. It's kind of a fancy word, but you can also say trigger. This is a commonly used word. It can trigger a feeling. And a really common thought pattern is that whatever the trigger was caused my feeling. But actually, it didn't cause my feeling. The feeling, or you can say the underlying need being met or unmet, we'll use unmet needs or unfulfilled needs in this case, because that's the more common case, especially with what are commonly called negative feelings like sadness or anxiety or anger, is that there's an underlying unfulfilled need. And there's kind of like this low grade, I'll call it emotional pain, right, all the time. But then when something happens, it might bring it into awareness. It might trigger a feeling. It might stimulate a feeling. And so we become super aware of it at that time. So, let's try and give a little example here in the emotional realm. Is let's say maybe some of us have the experience that someone has become like really irritable, and there's something going on and they're kind of upset about it. And then, you just made a comment to them or something. You're like, hey, it's time for dinner. Or like, hey, what are you up to today? And like, oh, why are you always asking me questions? Right? Or why are you telling me what to do? And you're like, whoa, where did that come from? Right? And on the one hand, it kind of seems like what I said like prompted a really like angry or irritated response. But on the other hand, it didn't seem like that's what caused it, because like I've asked that before, I've said that before, and never got that kind of response. It's like there's something else that was going on, right? And on the one hand, you can say, well, there is something else. There was another trigger. There is another thing that stimulated this anger, right? It might have been something that happened in their day. It might be something that they're dealing with. Maybe they're dealing with a breakup, or they're stressed out from work or something like that. And you're like, okay, that's the cause. The other thing is the cause. Actually, that's not quite the case. And in this case, instead of going too far down that road, what I'll just say is making the difference or clarifying the difference between a stimulus or a trigger and the underlying cause or the underlying need, which is that the actual cause of the feeling is an unmet need. And you can say that, stressors at work, or, a breakup or some kind of other situation can be a contributing factor for sure to this unmet need. But actually, the cause itself, at least in this framework, is the unmet need. It's something that just hasn't been met, right? And again, if we go back to like hunger as an example, hunger doesn't like happen to you at like one time. You're like, oh, at like 12:01 I'm not hungry, and at 12:02 I'm hungry. It's just kind of like this thing that goes on over time. My body is using, food, or it's using energy, and so it needs more. And the longer it goes, kind of like the greater the need becomes if I don't eat, right? So the longer I go without eating, the more urgent and the more desperate the need is going to be, and therefore the stronger the feeling of hunger is going to become, and then eventually it becomes like really, really obvious or even painful, right? And this is the same thing with emotional needs. It's actually not necessarily because of that stressor at work, or because of the breakup, or because something happened, and because I just asked you, something simple, or said something simple to you. What's happening is there's an emotional need that's not getting met, and over a period of time. And so this need is getting worse and worse and worse, or you can say this more and more urgent, more and more desperate, right? And that underlying need getting more and more serious is now starting to come out in all these really weird ways. So a smaller and smaller trigger, or a smaller and smaller stimulus, is still going to kind of stimulate that feeling, is going to trigger that feeling. In this case, we'll say anger or irritation, because that need is not getting met. And so I don't know if you've heard, like, when people are, really stressed out, then they become really irritable. So even really small things will bother them a lot. Well, actually, it's not necessarily that there's something pushing on them that's a stressor on them, right? That can definitely be a contributing factor. But the main underlying cause of the feeling or cause of that, mood, you can say, of irritation, or that basically constant condition of being easily irritated or irritable, is actually that something is not happening. There's a need that's not being met. And because of that, then it's producing this feeling, right? And it might be in a low grade way. It might come out in a weird way when there's certain triggers are in the situation. It can definitely be made worse by contributing factors such as stressors and other things that are going on. But the actual underlying cause is the need itself. It's something that's not getting met. So again, drawing the analogy back to hunger, the issue is not necessarily that there's a bunch of food out and you can't eat it, and that would obviously, if you're really hungry, be like really annoying to you. But it's the fact that you haven't eaten for a really long time, and that's really the underlying cause of the feeling. And so when we come to do a lot of things with Seek and Find Life, that's our basic understanding of why certain feelings are coming up. It's not that the stimulus is there. It's not that the trigger is there. If anything, actually, the stimulus or the trigger is very helpful because it's bringing the need into awareness. It's bringing something that you maybe weren't aware of, or maybe only aware of in a very low grade kind of way. And so you underestimated the importance of it. But actually, when that stimulus comes, when that trigger comes, and you get really angry, or you get really anxious, or you get really sad, or you react in this way. And a lot of times people will be like, well, it's like, why are you reacting to that? Like, that seems really like out of proportion, or whatever it is. Actually, you're not reacting to what just happened. You're reacting to something that's been going on for a long time, usually, and it's an underlying unmet need. And so this concept of stimulus versus cause is very important for us to understand the ways that people are thinking and feeling and behaving. And then, of course, those feelings, as we had mentioned in the previous episode, are going to give rise to thoughts. And those thoughts usually give rise to some kind of behavior, right? And this happens really fast, right? A lot of it's like very much automatic. So if you go back to the example I had given where it's like, hey, what are you up to today? Or like, why are you always asking me questions, right? So that, why are you always asking me questions? That kind of like those words, that kind of speaking is a behavior, right? And that behavior probably originated with a thought, right? In this case, probably the same thought, which was like, why are you asking me all these questions? And that thought was actually stimulated from a feeling of irritation, a feeling of anger, right? That decided to coalesce itself into this thought of like, why are you asking me questions? And eventually that thought made it out my mouth and all the way to you, right? And so that's kind of the idea of what's happening here, is that there's an ongoing situation, there's an ongoing underlying need that's not getting met. And then something happens, usually in our environment or around us, or someone says something, and that stimulates or triggers a feeling that's letting us know that there's this ongoing underlying condition. And then that's going to lead to some thoughts and some behaviors. But basically, the main thing that I wanted to get across in this video is the difference between a stimulus or a trigger and a cause. The stimulus or the trigger is not causing the feeling, right? It's the underlying unmet need or unfulfilled need. But the stimulus or the trigger is stimulating or triggering the feeling, which is really great because it's helping us accomplish. It may not look really great, in the moment, but it's actually really great because it's helping us accomplish our first goal, which is bringing needs into awareness. And the first thing, when we kind of dig into this goal of bringing needs into awareness, the first part is just to realize we have an unmet need. That's actually very important. The second part of that is identifying and accurately identifying what the need actually is. And as we go on in different videos, we may come to realize that it's actually not such a simple process to identify what the underlying need actually is, partly because we just weren't brought up that way. So a lot of times we didn't get a good education in how to identify needs based on our feelings and based on the situation. Another part of it is just, we don't have a lot of practice. And so it's not something that we're used to. And hopefully through, different areas of Seek and Find Life, we can help everyone to increase, to educate themselves, and then increase the practice in being able to accurately and quickly identify their underlying needs, and then more quickly get them fulfilled. And that's ultimately going to help the actual feeling or the situation, the underlying condition, and then eventually the feeling. Actually, we find when the underlying need gets fulfilled, then the feeling just kind of goes away, even with the same trigger. One last thing I wanted to mention is that feelings are very helpful indicators of our needs because they give us some information, not a ton of information, but some information on what the need actually is. And so one example I was using with a participant recently is, let's say that your significant other didn't pick up your phone call, right? And so you're calling them, you want to get in touch with them, and then, for whatever reason, they didn't pick up. And one way that we might feel is we feel like, oh, like I'm really sad, they didn't pick up my call, maybe they don't care about me, maybe they saw it and then, just decided not to pick up, and now I'm sad, right? That's one way that we could react. And that might show that we're needing connection. And so because we need connection, that's what we're wanting out of the call is, to talk to our significant other. Then when we didn't get that, then we kind of felt sad because that need is now unmet. Another example is maybe your significant other is coming to pick you up, right? You're somewhere and they're supposed to pick you up, but now they're late. And then you called them and they didn't pick up. And so now you might feel anxious. You don't feel sad. Actually, you feel anxious because you're worried, like, oh, like, did something happen to them? Are they okay? Right? I want to make sure that nothing is going on. And so this is actually a little bit different, right? And so this could come out of a need for concern, right? Like I'm wanting to make sure they're okay, right? I want to make sure everything is fine with this person that I care about, right? And so that's a little bit different. The underlying need there is you want the peace of mind to know that this person is okay. Another example is maybe you're calling them and you had to talk about something that's like, you didn't want to talk about. Maybe you made a mistake. You said something you shouldn't have said. And you're calling them to apologize, but you feel a little bit like uncomfortable, like, I really don't want to do this. Like, and when they don't pick up, you actually feel relieved, right? They're like, oh, sweet. I'll just, do it a little bit later. I have a little bit more time, right? And so that could show you that there's a different underlying need there where you have a need for emotional safety, right? Is like, I want to make sure that when I call, I'm not going to get yelled at. I'm not going to get judged. I'm not going to get told that, I never should have done that, right? And so because of that, I actually felt, relieved when my significant other didn't pick up the call because my need was different, right? Because my need in this case was for emotional safety. And the reason I bring up this example is that you can see that the same trigger or the same stimulus can actually stimulate or give rise to different kinds of feelings based on my different needs. And so it's actually pointing to different needs. Similarly speaking, the same trigger can give rise to different needs, different feelings based on different needs, or the same trigger can give rise not give rise to the same feeling. In other words, one day, this person says something to me, and I get really upset. I'm like, why would you do that? Why would you say that to me? But maybe a month later, they say the same thing to me, and it doesn't bother me, right? And so again, this is just showing us that the same stimulus or the same trigger doesn't cause the feeling, right? It's that I had a pre-existing and underlying need that was being fulfilled or not fulfilled, right? And you can call it like an underlying condition. And then when the trigger came, when the stimulus came, it brought it into awareness. It made it like super obvious to me, right? So it's just like when that doctor pressed my stomach, right? And in that certain area, it like made it really hurt. Is you had something going on that was already pre-existing, that was already happening. And then when somebody, quote unquote, pressed your stomach, right? When somebody triggered it, when they did something, when something happened to you, then it made it like super obvious to you in the form of a very strong or clear feeling. And so again, the main goal of this section of the video is just to clarify the difference between a trigger and the cause. The cause is the underlying feeling, and the stimulus is just what happened that made me aware of it via a feeling. And so again, the last thing here is stimulus versus cause. This is basically just review now, which is stimulus or trigger. It brings a need into awareness through a feeling. And the cause, the actual cause of the feeling itself, is a pre-existing underlying need, either being fulfilled or unfulfilled. Unsurprisingly, the the majority of our focus is going to be on unfulfilled needs. But at least it's helpful to know that that feelings can be caused by either fulfilled or unfulfilled needs. But in either case, it's because of an underlying need. And so here you go. This is the now puzzle piece framework that got a little bit more added to it from last time, which is you have the needs leading to feelings, leading to thoughts, leading to behavior. And then you can see that what we're consciously aware of is feelings, thoughts, and behavior, but we're not so consciously aware of needs. And we're able to consciously and directly control thoughts and behavior, but we're not able to consciously or directly control needs and feelings. And then finally is that needs are the underlying cause of our feelings, but the stimulus or the trigger for our feelings is whatever happened in the environment or whatever somebody said to us or something else like that. But that's actually not the cause. It's just bringing that into awareness. And that's it for today. So again, if you have any questions, you didn't understand anything, feel free to comment on this video or email me at david@seekandfind.life. Always looking forward to hearing from you and how you're feeling. And I hope this video was helpful in understanding the relationship between feelings and needs, as well as awareness and control over the different parts of this process in this framework. Thanks so much, and we hope to see you for our next video.